This is our 1994 Toyota Hiace Super Custom. We bought this last spring with only 50,000 miles on it. It's a full-time 4x4 with a turbo diesel, and it's amazing. We had great fun camping all over New Mexico, Colorado, and Idaho. After about 12,000 miles, we noticed a humming sound coming from the rear differential. Sadly, it turns out the pinion and carrier bearings were bad. So I started compiling the specialty tools, supplies, and parts I needed for the project. Then my friend James called me. His marriage was in great distress. After asking for prayer for our dear friends and sharing my current project of replacing the bearings in my van's rear differential, my friend Nick challenged me to do a comparison between bearings and marriage. This was a welcome idea, as I was having a hard time coming up with a good topic for an upcoming Sabbath lesson. As I dug into the bearing job, all the while considering the idea of the comparison, I was astounded by the similarities and the depth of the lesson. As a result, this is the lesson that came to be. I call it Marriage Lessons from an Automotive Differential. A comparison like this will not always walk on all fours, so to speak, but there will be some spiritual similarities we will investigate. As I was considering marriage and mechanics, I came across this picture. This is an actual engagement photo I found online. The look on their faces makes me think of a couple who are working together and thoughtfully navigating their way through marriage. Let us begin. This is an automotive differential. It's a dirty, oily, often neglected, overlooked, and misunderstood part of the car. Here it is in context to the other parts of the car. If you have an automobile, there's a good chance you have one or two of these. Exceptions would be front-wheel drive cars and electric cars, among others. Well, could you ever imagine there could be an example of a Christ-centered marriage hidden inside this differential? I had no idea. Talk about a treasure hidden in an earthen vessel. Let's begin with a couple definitions. Bearings. The word bearing means to bear, as in to support, to carry a burden. In a building sense, a part that carries a load. Take a look at this beautiful timber frame automotive shop with exposed posts and beams. The arrows indicate the point to where the horizontal beam transfers the weight or load of the roof to the vertical posts. This is the bearing location. Now let's understand bearings in a mechanical or machine application. A bearing is a part that carries a load, but also rotates efficiently with minimal amount of friction. Specifically, in our application, we are speaking of two tapered roller bearings, which carries a load in multiple directions, radially and axially, while spinning. You can see the tapered feature of the bearing pointed out. Torque. Torque is used here as a rotational force applied to a nut that results in a clamping force or pressure. In our application, the two plates shown in the previous diagram will be two bearings being pulled or clamped together. Here is a close-up, cutaway view of a differential. The yellow lines show where the differential was cut away in order for us to observe its inner workings. Inside, we were looking at an assembled pinion shaft with bearings, spacer, and nut holding everything together. Let's remove the pinion shaft and bearings from the assembly to get a closer look. This is a bare pinion shaft. In our study, it represents Christ and the power of His Spirit. By necessity of the application, we will be adding two bearings to the pinion shaft. The bearings represent the husband and wife. Proverbs 18:22. Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth favor from the Lord. The first bearing we install near the pinion gear is much larger and heavier duty than the one near the opposite end. It is designed to take heavier stresses. than the smaller bearing. The large bearing represents the husband. Note that he is centered on Christ. Genesis 2:18 and 24. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." The second smaller bearing is not as strong, but equally as important. The smaller bearing represents the woman, and she also is centered on Christ. 1 Peter 3:7. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. These two bearings must work together. Although one is designed for heavier stress, remember they are both required for proper operation. Ecclesiastes 4:9 through 12. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Thinking of the pinion shaft as Christ's spirit, it unites these two bearings, which are the husband and wife, one stronger, one weaker. They are joined in an intimate, purposeful connection. These bearings are centered on the shaft. The shaft will cause both bearings to rotate together, carrying their respective loads towards one goal or purpose. Likewise, God's Spirit joins a man and a woman in holy matrimony. Their mission is working together to share the gospel by the display of God's power, working through their marriage. In this example, the bearings don't work alone, and as a pair, they don't work independently. They are driven by the shaft that connects them. In a marriage, the individual is not to work alone, but side by side with their spouse. Collectively, they are not to work without the joining of and the power from Christ's Spirit. Ephesians 5:30. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. But who noticed that a part was added between our two bearings? Between the two bearings is a spacer sleeve and shims were installed. When properly installed, the spacer sleeve and shims are in contact with the bearings, and the bearings are bound to it. So what does this spacer represent? Colossians 3:14. And above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. The spacer sleeve here represents love, or charity as the Bible calls it. The spacer has a critical role in the proper operation. The spacer has a series of shims stacked on it in order to precisely adjust its length. By adding or subtracting a series of shims, you can adjust the length of the spacer, shorter or longer, in increments of 1/1000th of an inch. That's about 1/4 the thickness of a human hair. The spacer and shim stack is installed between the two bearings during assembly. This is love that is cultivated during courtship and continues to be for life, binding them to each other. Ephesians 5:31. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. If the spacer and shim stack is not precisely the correct length, either too long or too short, premature wear and failure of the bearings will result. Mind you, not just failure of the bearings, but potentially surrounding components as well. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? Yet the problem with my example is there is still a nut that must be tightened. And the question arises, does that nut have a spiritual significance? Remember earlier we discussed a term called torque, and how in this application torque of a nut would create a clamping force or pressure. In our case, the clamping pressure will be on the bearings in the spacer. Let's install our parts into the differential body. Notice we have the husband bearing, the love spacer, the wife bearing, all centered on the shaft representing Christ and his Spirit, all held together by the nut. A specific torque or clamping pressure on the bearings is required to maintain this connection of the bearings to the spacer through something called bearing preload. Bearing preload is the process of adding a sustained axial load to a bearing. Bearing preload being the result of specific shim thickness, creating correct spacer length, and specific external pressure from torquing the nut. The spacer on its own could not keep the two bearings together. An external force is required to do this. This external force is provided by the nut, which is tightened, resulting in the bearings being pressed towards each other in contact with the spacer. Remember, we get this preload or pressure from the nut. The nut represents God's love, tightening down and holding everything together. Matthew 19, 4 through 6. And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Here is a quote from some engineer. Properly preloading bearings can increase the bearing's life and eliminate the vibration and noise that results from specified clearance, manufacturing precision, and wear. What did that say? Vibration and noise from wear? This makes me think of turmoil and friction that can arise in a relationship from the stress of living in a fallen world. When both husband and wife are bound by Christ and following biblical principles, forgiving one another, not taking offense, dying to self, etc., there is peace, quiet, and a smoothness in the relationship. Ephesians 4, 2 and 3. With all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit of the bond of peace. Forbearing. Bond. The Hebrew word for bearing means to bear with. Are you seeing a theme here? The Hebrew word for bond means of ligaments by which the members of the human body are united together. In the case of our two bearings and the spacer, they are bound by an outside force of peace and love. 1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us. And it's only because he first loved us that we are able to love each other. Therefore, tightening the nut at the end of the pinion shaft creates a perfect tension on the shaft and a pressure on the bearings against the spacer sleeve. So bearing preload is basically pressure applied to the bearings by means of torque on the nut. This pressure is a good thing and will actually make the bearings last longer. During the installation, it took me about 5 or 6 attempts of removing the pinion shaft and bearing, adding or subtracting shims to the spacer, and applying torque to this nut to get the proper preload on the bearings. So what does this external pressure created by the torqued nut represent? It took me a while to understand it, but I woke up one Sabbath morning with a verse in my head about constraining love. 2 Corinthians 5:14. For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge, that if one died for all, then we're all dead. The Hebrew word for constrain means to hold together with constraint, to compress. Webster's 1828 dictionary defines constrain as to hold by force, to press, to confine. Wow, how does that fit our analogy? It's really not our physical bond we have with our spouses. It's the love of Christ, the power of His Spirit that does the work. You can see the parallel between the torqued nut compressing and compacting the bearings and the constraining love of God. Here is a bigger picture of the differential body and the other parts of the axle. Ultimately, when the pinion shaft, bearings, spacer, nut, etc. are installed in the differential housing, this unit becomes an essential component within the larger differential and axle, much like a married couple working within the body of Christ. Ephesians 4:15 and 16. Christ, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Thank you for listening to this message. May God bless your marriage.